Across the country Tuesday, hundreds of people turned out for protests demanding migrant detention centers be closed.
We are collectively astounded and horrified at the cruelty that is going on in our...
Associated Press detailed conditions inside a Customs and Border Patrol detention center in Clint, Texas, where allegedly 250 infants, children, and teenagers are being held. According to the AP, there's not adequate food, water, or sanitation inside.
Alabama's state Senate passed a bill last night that'll virtually outlaw all abortions. The Senate voted 25-6 after the measure overwhelmingly passed in the House. State lawmakers say that the move is an effort to get the Supreme Court to reverse nationwide protections for abortion.
With the ink barely dry on Alabama's new abortion law, the strictest in the nation, the movement to push anti-abortion legislation in other states is gathering steam.
This is a very backward step for women's rights. I think life should be protected.
Fourth time in less than 2 weeks, North Korea has test-fired 2 more missiles that were launched from a southwestern province across the peninsula into the sea towards Japan. Pyongyang says they're in response to those US-South Korean military exercises, which are, quote, an undisguised denial and flagrant violation of agreements struck between the US and the North. Now, back at the Singapore summit last year, Donald Trump was criticized after seeming to agree with Kim Jong-un about these drills, even calling them, quote, provocative, which is language usually only used by the North.
President Trump is set to impose major new sanctions on Iran today. They're expected to target the country's military and oil revenue. The move comes after Iran downed the U.S. drone and attacked oil tankers in the Middle East.
For the 10 Democrats on stage last night, an existential question: how far left to go? More moderate candidates like former Maryland Congressman John Delaney set their sights on the party's left flank.
So I think Democrats win when we run on real solutions, not impossible promises. When we run on things that are workable, not fairy tale economics.
From Senators Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Bernie Sanders of Vermont, the party's 2 liberal leaders standing center stage, a united front.
You know, I don't understand why anybody goes to all the trouble of running for president of the United States just to talk about what we really can't do and shouldn't fight for.
I get a little bit tired of Democrats afraid of big ideas.
It's a divide that played out for nearly every issue as Democrats debated the best way to defeat President Trump.
Well, with that, welcome. Welcome to today's event. My name is Leslie Parkins. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Civic Engagement with the Office of Durham and Community Affairs. We hope this video is a bit of an introduction for some of the things we're going to be talking about today. Putting together this event is always interesting. There are so many things happening in our world that are concerning, that feel like an urgent crisis that we need to be talking about. And we felt like to start the semester off here at Duke, we want to begin by giving space for us to talk with each other, to hear from our panelists today, and for this to be a place where we are going to engage in really difficult topics. We also are revisiting some topics that came up in last year's event, which also is a reminder of the place we're at in our world today. We hope that you enjoy today's event, that this is a way to get connected, and I would recommend if there are topics that you learn about today that you're interested in doing something locally about, I'd recommend for you to consider the volunteer fair that's coming up on September 19th, where we'll have local organizations that are asking for volunteers from the Duke community. It's a great way, if you're feeling like I want to learn more about an issue, I want to get connected, that's a great way to learn about how you can do that. The Office of Durham and Community Affairs is here to connect the campus and Durham together, and we'd be happy to serve you in ways that we can. So please put September 19th on your calendar. And Deondra, you're going to offer some more.
So hi everybody, I'm Deondra Rose, and I want to add a few words of welcome to Leslie, and to thank Leslie and Lindsay and Dennis Clemens and the Office of Civic Engagement for being our partners in hosting this event today. Also on behalf of POLIS, I want to welcome you on behalf of our faculty director, Matt McCorkle, who's back in the back there. We also have Associate Director BJ Rudell, who I'll have the pleasure of offering a little more of an extensive introduction for, though he needs no introduction in a few moments. Many of you are familiar with POLIS, so we are the Politics Center here at Duke and at Sanford, and it's really the hub for politics. So if you're looking for an on-ramp into politics, potentially for your own political career, or you're interested in gaining some insights into how to get involved, or you just want to engage in some really rich conversation and discourse, we are the place for you. We have so many amazing, very exciting events planned for this year. We hope to see you there. And the new leadership team is really looking forward to building on the legacy that was established by our founding director, Professor Fritz Mayer. Many of you might know Professor Mayer, who's now the Dean of the Corbell School at the University of Denver. But we have this new team, and we're excited to work with all of you, so welcome. And without much additional ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, BJ Riddell, who is Associate Director of POLIS. BJ's career trajectory is illustrious, and it has included stints on Capitol Hill. He's also worked on a presidential campaign, in a newsroom, in classrooms, and for a consulting firm. BJ is the author of 3 books. His political commentary has appeared in The Hill, in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, in the Dallas Morning News, and many other news outlets. And he's also provided commentary on Fox News, CNN, and dozens of radio stations across the country. BJ is a graduate of Davidson College, and little known facts, he's a master of improv, and he's also a champion at fantasy, was it football or athletics in general? Competitions in general? All right, so welcome, BJ.
Good. So, yeah. Thank you, Deondra. Well, thank you for that. And now I'm going to turn it back. This is a little bit weird. It's the first event, so we're all kind of introducing ourselves, but we have 3 esteemed faculty panelists here. And let's just take a moment for each of them to introduce themselves so you know who the experts in the room are.
Sure. Hi, I'm Simon Miles. I'm an assistant professor here at the Sanford School with an appointment also in the Department of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. I'm a diplomatic historian. I mostly work on the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. That is actually how I spent my summer, was in the former Soviet sphere. I spent very little time at home. And I work on American foreign policy and also contemporary Russian politics.
I'm Suzanne Shanahan. I direct the Keenan Institute for Ethics. I'm also a professor in the sociology department. My work is on refugee law and policy, work mostly on refugee and migrant issues in the United States, but also in the Middle East and South Asia, although I just started a new project in Rwanda where I spent most of my summer.
Hi everybody, Deondra Rose. I'm an assistant professor here at the Sanford School. I'm a political scientist. I also hold a secondary appointment in political science here at Duke. I also serve as director of research for POLIS. And my work is basically focused on U.S. higher education policy. So I'm a political historian, and I tend to do work that focuses on American political development as well as identity politics, especially interested in things like gender, race, and class. Really excited to be here.
Great. So to start things off, we're just going to have each professor share a little bit about their area of expertise as it relates to some of the things that have been happening this summer. Just to offer some overview of why these issues are important. For some of you, they might have a direct impact on your life. For some of you, it might be indirect. For those who feel like it has no effect, I would suggest that it does have an indirect, at the very least, impact, and that's why we're here today to talk about these issues. So Suzanne, if you want to start with a little bit about your main topic of interest.
Okay, so I think the first thing to say, and I mentioned it in my introduction, I actually spent most of my summer abroad, which I think gave me a really interesting perspective on what's happening in the United States, because I was not watching US media, but kind of looking and seeing what was happening on the US border through the lens of other media. Which put it in a really kind of different context for me. And what I've been trying to figure out is sort of the relationship between the rhetoric of what's happening and what's actually happening, and how the rhetoric is distorting our perception of what is actually right and wrong happening on the border. I think, as most people know, sort of concerns about an invasion from the South began in about 2016, when this was an all-time low of border crossings historically, and yet the language was kind of heating up around concerns about crossing into the United States. There have been recent increases starting just in this past October. We're still at a pretty historic low in terms of people coming into the United States. through the southern border, and I think that's important context. But because of the political rhetoric around that, there's a real perception that this is an enormous crisis, that it's being poorly managed. And I think that what therefore is happening is the counter response is sort of misgauging where they should be more strategic. And let me give you sort of some of the basic facts and then the policy response to illustrate this particular phenomenon. So as I said, really, starting in 2016, we were at historical low numbers in terms of border crossings. The recent uptick started just in October. What's really different about the migration flow across the southern border are two things. One, now it is increasingly family-driven, so many more women and children crossing, many more unaccompanied minors crossing. There aren't the same flow of single men pursuing work, right? So that's number one. The second is the number of people who are fleeing based on a well-founded fear of persecution and coming to the United States seeking asylum. This was previously not the case in terms of unregulated border crossings, that people were coming for work, they weren't ever seeking asylum in the way they are now. In 2017, about 50,000 individuals crossing the border were identified as those sort of fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution or given a refugee status upon crossing, right? Those are pretty unprecedented numbers. In 2018, that number doubled, right? So the kinds of reasons people are coming across the border are really different, and the kinds of individuals coming across the border are super different, right? So that's sort of the context of it. This is not a historic crisis by any means, but the populations are different. In terms of the kinds of political response that we're seeing strategically, one is the rhetoric, which I think is super hopped up. This is an invasion, right? There are terrorists coming across the border. This is a horrible, horrible thing. And then there's the counter response, right? Politically and strategically, the kinds of things actually happening on the border aren't super different, with the exception of the separation of families. Family separations is a historic thing that has happened in the United States for about the past 50 years, but only super, super rarely. When you combine that with the fact that there weren't many families entering the United States, and then it was rare, right, you have tiny, tiny numbers of separations. So it's not that this didn't exist prior, it's suddenly this is becoming routine, and there are many, many more families crossing the border. Right? You then have families separated or together in conditions that by any standard of human rights, whether that's the United States, whether that's Rwanda, whether that's Europe, are considered inhumane. That people's basic rights are not guaranteed in those spaces. So, right, and we have lots of attention to that particular phenomenon. Again, what's interesting is the conditions are not unusual. It's just the magnitude of the phenomenon that's unusual, right? And our public attention to it is much greater. That there are many more detentions as opposed to the kind of catch and release policy that had existed. So it's a magnitude issue. And then there is the kind of response to this. The kind of weird thing about US immigration policy is the policies take a freakishly long time to get passed anytime you have a new immigration law. And in fact, if you look historically since the late 1700s to the present, it generally takes about 19 years to pass a policy. So there's a problem, lots and lots of debate, lots and lots of mess, and then finally there's a resolution that's responding to something that happened 19 years prior, which is kind of messed up and not super functional. So what's happened really, starting with Clinton moving forward, are a set of executive orders that, right, the president enacts to try to manage in the interim between these different acts. And so that's the kind of context that we have here, right? So a couple of really critical policy things that have happened. So the US Immigration and Nationality Act, right, says that an individual crossing the border in any place into the United States is able to claim asylum. right? You don't have to go through a port of like a legal port of entry. You cross the border, and the first authority member you see, you need to say, I'm seeking asylum. That is a legal entry according to US law, right? And that's pretty common across countries internationally, right? You don't have to come in through the airport. You don't have to come in through an official border crossing. That's US law, right? What's happened recently, right, starting in 2018 is an executive order saying, no, you have to come in through a legal port of entry, right? Which, right, is then undermining the original law. So that's the first thing that's happened, which really makes it challenging for people to seek asylum. The second thing is a strategic policy, which is not via executive order, but by executive bureaucracy, is to slow down the asylum applications, right, through a process of metering. What this means is that asylum hearings, which generally happen in batches, so this entire room would be seeking asylum simultaneously, and there'd be a summary judgment, oftentimes, for the entire population, are happening super, super slowly. This is creating a deliberative backlog, right? So you have people who can now only come in through ports of entry. If you come in otherwise, right, it's considered an illegal crossing, subject to immediate deportation. If you come in through a legal entry and seek asylum, you are in these batch hearings that can take forever, right? The conditions in which people are held is a deliberative attempt to make it as miserable as possible, right? So the goal is for seeking asylum in the United States to be a miserable thing, right? It's you're likely to get your family separated, you are going to be in miserable conditions, and it will take forever, right? So this is the strategy to discourage, right, people seeking asylum in the United States. The interesting thing about this is common practice everywhere in the world. There are very few places that this is not a common strategy, right? That this is how countries discourage, right, people who aren't super eager or super desperate to kind of be in the situation, right? It's also the case that the crazy thing about both the Refugee Convention and the 67 Amendment of it is that, right, all a country needs to do is make sure you're no longer being persecuted, right? They're not obligated to, right, ensure your human rights. They're not obligated to, right, provide a comfortable place for you to land. All they have to do is make sure the person you are fleeing, right, you are safe from, right? And so you can be in a cage and still be consistent with the basic conventions on those things. The other thing that's happened, which is really important, is, again, by executive order, is the removal of an ability to seek asylum on the basis of gang violence or domestic violence, right, which were two of the really frequent criterion individuals coming into the country, right, seeking sort of redress from that kind of persecution. The challenge there, right, the argument made is that those aren't traditional categories. So it's not race, religion, social group, or political persecution, right? And from, right, a US perspective, that may be the case, but many of the places people fleeing from, there is a huge correlation between gang violence and political violence, and gang violence, domestic violence, and political violence. These are all interrelated, and so breaking out those categories really then undermines a huge host of claims that are possible. I think where I get it's sort of interesting in hearing the international response, right? You know, a lot of times if you're in a place like Rwanda or you're a place like Lebanon that have lots of refugees, right, it's kind of, you know, the response is like, what's the big deal in the United States? Why can't, you know, sort of a country like this manage this? But also, why are they upset about the things they're upset about? And not upset about other kinds of things. And so a couple of other things that have happened. One, we've seen drops in July and August in terms of the immigration flows. And this is really largely attributable to the Mexican troops that are on the Guatemala side and on the US side, right? And people are, right, a lot of Americans are super upset about this deployment of the Mexican military in this way. This is, again, from an international perspective, super common strategy. There is a principle of first asylum in most places. So the first safe haven you're supposed to seek asylum, right? It's supposed to be redressed there, and then there can be secondary migration or resettlement if necessary, right? So from an international perspective, right, people's concerns there seem kind of unfounded, where people internationally have super concerns about the human rights and the conditions and how sort of a country with the United States resources is not responding with greater compassion, generosity, and sense of humanitarian kind of effort there. So that's kind of the kind of quick and dirty of where it is. Yeah, I'll stop talking.
Thank you, Suzanne. Deondra, do you want to jump in with some thoughts that you have about issues you care about?
Sure. So I think for me, as somebody who pays a lot of attention to identity politics, I'm really struck by, like Suzanne points out, this rhetoric of invasion, this idea of invasion as a political concept. And I'm struck by, there's also this theme of the politics of crisis or emergency that tends to be front and center of a lot of the politics we're seeing. And so, I was thinking about this summer here in North Carolina when the president came for a rally, and one of his important talking points was about this, they're known as the Squad of 4 progressive women. And he commented on, this idea that they're seeking America's destruction. And I think there's this really interesting question of change and some interesting old guard versus new guard and generational shifts that are going on right now. So our recent primaries were some of the most diverse in recent history. And we saw this ushering of a particularly diverse group of lawmakers into Congress, for example, in a lot of state legislatures across the country. And so now we're starting to see what tensions emerge from that change. And so the squad that the president is talking about in particular, the average age is about 38 years old of those congressional representatives, where in the entire chamber, the average age, I want to say, is in the late 50s. I want to say it's 56, 58 or so. And so there's this interesting rhetoric of change, and it echoes this idea of invasion, but it's in our elite political spaces. And so for me, one of the things I'm really wondering is, do we see harbingers of future political discourse? Do we see an increasing, can we prognosticate that coming down the pike, there will be some continued tensions between those who've been in power for a long time, those who feel some sense of ownership over the country, a lot of rhetoric about protecting our country, or people who don't appreciate our country, and others who are pushing back on what our country actually means and what that looks like. So for me, I think there's some really interesting questions, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this in our discussion, about identity and different interest groups and what it means to be, quote unquote, an American in this particular domestic space.
Thanks, Deondra. Son?
Sure. So to continue on this uplifting note, I think there were 3 countries with which the United States had pretty important interactions over the course of the summer, and the first is North Korea. In February of 2019, the summit in Hanoi failed, as many people, myself including, expected it to. And the reason for this is actually very simple, because in no way, shape, or form is it in North Korea's interest to give up its nuclear weapons program. Nuclear weapons are very, very expensive. They're expensive to build, and they are even more expensive, actually, to maintain. Maintaining a nuclear arsenal is not an inexpensive proposition. But they do one thing really, really, really well, which is guarantee the survival of your regime. If you want to know what it looks like when you have them and you give them up, look at what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. The video is on YouTube, and I don't advise eating it before or after a meal. Look at what happened to Saddam Hussein with his weapons of mass destruction program. These are not alien concepts to a North Korean policymaker, and especially not to the Kim family, which we know have been historically really obsessed with the concept of plots to overthrow them, undermine them, etc. Not without reason, as they're a brutal dictatorship who deserves what they have coming to them. So North Koreans have no interest whatsoever in getting rid of their nuclear weapons. They do have an enormous interest, however, in propaganda. North Korea, as a totalitarian state, needs propaganda in order to survive. And they got a real doozy in June of 2019 when Donald Trump became the first president of the United States to cross over into North Korea at the demilitarized zone, Pyongyang Peace Village, in exchange for absolutely nothing, in exchange for no concessions, in exchange for absolutely nothing from the North Koreans. He gave them what was on North Korean state TV, which, again, I don't actually recommend anyone watch because it is wacky, was presented as the greatest victory over the imperial Satan that could be ever conceived of by military, strategic, and political genius Kim Jong-un. Now, the North Koreans have been ramping up their weapons programs. Over the summer in particular, they were testing 4 platforms. I won't get into the really technical details, but there is one that we should care about, which is the KN-23 short-range ballistic missile. So ballistic missiles basically fly in a parabola. And during their reentry phase, during their downward trajectory, they're very easy comparatively to shoot down. It's actually really hard to do it, and the extent to which ballistic missile defense has become an article of faith in American policymaking circles, I think is very rose-colored, to put it mildly. But the KN-23 flies a lot flatter. Flies a lot flatter, which makes it a lot harder to stop, especially for the theater missile defense equipment that the United States has there, which is safeguarding the United States-South Korean ally. Why are they doing this? I would argue, one, as we saw the clip, is to put pressure on the United States to stop the exercises, the joint exercises with the ROK military. In this respect, they have a pretty sympathetic audience in the president, who is not only skeptical of alliances qua alliances, but sees them basically as transactional enterprises, and I think doesn't recognize the value that they bring to the to the United States, but especially to try to accelerate the push for a nuclear deal. There's been talk coming out of the White House of settling more for a nuclear freeze as opposed to denuclearization, i.e. just saying, okay, well, if we just leave it here, where here includes a missile with a credible capability to reach the continental United States, and you don't build any more, then we'll just freeze it, and then we'll give you sanctions relief. The president gets a victory, the supreme dear leader gets a victory, but North Korea remains a nuclear state, as opposed to denuclearization, which I think is not a realistic thing to push for at this juncture based on what the North Koreans need. It's also interesting to note that the US's 2 key allies in the region, Japan and South Korea, are having a little bit of a spat right now. The Japanese and the South Koreans have a major intelligence sharing program, primarily focused on North Korea's nuclear missile program. The South Koreans have the best view of the liftoff phase of a North Korean missile. The Japanese have the best view of the glide phase, the reentry phase of a North Korean missile. When you put those together, you have a very good picture of a capability. Now they are no longer talking. They're no longer actually putting them together. You only get half the story. Let's move now from one charming country to another, Iran, another great vacation spot. So the U.S. withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the Iran deal, better known to great fanfare, has led to Iran stockpiling more uranium and enriching its uranium to a higher level. So the JCPOA capped the stockpiles at about 600 tons, and the enrichment caps at 3.65, I think is the number. The Iranians have exceeded the 600 figure. They're over 5% comfortably with their enrichment of uranium. Just to reassure you, weapons grade is 90%, and weapons grade is really hard to get to. It's expensive and it's time consuming, but that's not the direction you want to go when it comes to the enrichment of uranium. And the United States and Iran sparked some clashes over the course of the summer with the Iranians' attacks on third country flagged oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman. The Iranians deny that they did this. That is, I think, that's demonstrably a lie. The reason they're doing this is, one, to put pressure on the United States, and to try to get the United States to not necessarily back down, but just not retaliate, which will be a diplomatic victory for them, but also to drive up the price of oil. The sanctions which the Trump administration imposed after itself withdrawing from the JCPOA have reduced the ability of Iran to sell oil on the market. In order to make up for that, they are trying to make what oil they can sell command a higher price, and thus to kind of offset the quantity versus quality debate. There was, of course, the episode where the Iranians shot down an American unmanned aerial vehicle, which they claim had strayed into Iranian territory. The United States claims was in international airspace, to which the United States retaliated, as the New York Times reported, with a cyber attack, and not with any kind of what we would call a kinetic attack, which actually destroyed lives or property. Because Donald Trump claims he, saw the light and he didn't want to hurt anyone. It's unknown if there was. I mean, there are obviously a whole bevy of attack plans in the American military's arsenal. There are also attack plans for Canada, so don't get too worried about that. I'm told that the calligraphy on those ones is really impressive. But again, the tension's mounted, and now they've kind of plateaued. And then the last country I want to mention is Russia. First of all, the INF Treaty, which had been in force since the beginning of 1988, signed to great fanfare by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in December of 1987, has now collapsed. Amid, of course, a lot of mutual blame. The Russians say that the American offshore Aegis system, which was based in Romania, was a violation of the terms of the INF Treaty, which prohibits nuclear weapons that can travel between 500 and 1,500 kilometers. That is a stretch. The United States claims that the Russians are testing a new launch platform, which actually does violate that. That's a much more credible claim. But the fact of the matter is that arms control agreement is dead. The only arms control agreement between the United States and Russia now is called New START, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. It's important about the INF Treaty to understand that though we look at it as part of the glorious end of the Cold War, the kind of Reagan and Gorby arm-in-arm walking across Red Square, INF was a wildly unfair deal for the Soviet Union when they signed it, which, the Soviet Union was very weak at that time. That's not a moral judgment I'm passing. The side with more chips got the better end of that deal. It was the Russians ended up, the Soviets, and then the Russians ended up destroying 4 missiles for every 1 that the United States destroyed. INF covered ground-launched missiles and not air-launched or sea-launched missiles, both of which the United States enjoys a massive superiority in, and thus was really to the U.S.'s benefit. But it looks like New START is also going to collapse as both parties no longer believe that there's a valued arms control between them. I think that creates a real risk of inadvertent escalation in the theater and also worldwide. But in happier news, we are told by the president that Vladimir Putin is going to make his triumphant return to the G7 after being booted out for invading another sovereign country and stealing its land. But he's going to come back to the G7, and said G7 is, of course, going to be held at the Trump Doral Resort in beautiful Miami, Florida. 2 other just things that I think were interesting. One, it's Back to the Future. Both buying Greenland and nuking hurricanes were really popular ideas in the late 1940s, which fell out of favor for a while. The Greenland one, because the United States got a great deal on the Thule Air Base and didn't need to buy an entire island, which, savings. The nuking storms one, for reasons which I presumably don't need to go into at great length. Here, suffice it to say that while there is actually a lot of research that says that it would stop a hurricane, it would also irradiate the entire world. So, life is a game of trade-offs, I recognize, but that one is pretty clear. And then finally, the futile trade war with the People's Republic of China continues. Calling it a trade war is, I think, a colossal misnomer. It is basically government intervention in a free market in the form of, 1, the imposition of massive new taxes on Americans, primarily called tariffs, but they are taxes on goods which Americans will pay. I read this morning as I was getting a few notes together for this that the average American household will be out about $1,000 next year. For some people, that's not a big deal. For a lot of Americans, that is a very big deal, and that matters to their bottom line. And then, of course, the U.S. government is bailing out farmers because of the deleterious consequences of the U.S. government's own policy. Instead of selling soybeans to China, the Chinese are now buying those primarily in Brazil. There are lots of soybean fields now lying fallow with farmers being paid to do nothing by the taxpayer because the administration decided to pursue this, this trade war, which is, I think, going absolutely nowhere.
So realizing after all this that we probably should have offered academic credit for all of you, for this is a lot of great information. So I'm going to do some rapid fire, but feel free to take time answering. Just trying to round out kind of thinking on different issues. If we have time at the end, it would be great to get some questions from you all. We don't want to deprive you of that, and there are some things we want to get to with this. So feel free in about 10, 15 minutes. Just a heads up, we can go over, if some of you want to go over, we might be able to stay a little bit past 12:30. First question for Deondra. Deondra and I have been looking at each other back here, so I need to look up here now.
We'll lean back.
That's not interesting. So demographically, this country is changing, and we're also in this point where the Republican Party has pushed a great deal to the right, pretty much over the last 40 years, but we've seen kind of a next step in that direction over the past few years. And the Democratic Party is trying to determine its future, whether or not it moves further to the left. And meanwhile, we have a demographic shift in the country that is changing the color of the country, which politically shifts things a little more to the left just based on demographics and the way things currently align between Democrats and Republicans. So I guess an overarching question for you, Deondra, is what does this mean, do you feel, when you hear Donald Trump attack the squad, when you hear Democrats attack Donald Trump? What do you think is the strategy between the two parties, and where do you see this going after 2020?
I mean, my sense is that the parties recognize the value of playing on each other's anxiety related to demographic change, and they're doing it really well. And I think we're seeing this especially in the context of our primaries. So on the right, we're seeing President Trump on the sort of the rally circuit, testing out what I think is his strategy for 2020. And I think he's really trying to see how the responses that he's getting from his lines, and they're working for him. Was it Greenville, North Carolina? The rally that I talked about a little earlier today. I mean, it was a packed rally, and there were chants of "send her back," and that's reminiscent of "lock her up" from 2016. And so my sense is, there is some anxiety about the demographic shifts, and there are people who feel left behind by government, left behind by public policy. And I think a lot of what the right has done successfully is to basically convince a lot of people who are feeling left out and left behind that somebody's paying attention to them. Somebody will pay attention to them with public policy. I think on the left, we're seeing similarly this emphasis on change, and some of it is, really trying to pull the nation in a particular direction policy-wise. So Medicare for All is now, the New York Times reported on this earlier today, a standard, something that many of the Democratic field are taking as a serious policy proposal, whereas that would have been extremely left-wing a few years ago. And so I think there is this interesting pull by a progressive wing on the left to pull public policy along in a way that might seem extreme or might have seemed extreme in recent years. And I think a lot of that is because people are really recognizing not only the demographic change, but the expanding difference between the haves and the have-nots. Since the 1970s, we've seen expanding economic inequality. People are also recognizing historical inequality. So recognize, like the New York Times recently put out the 1619 report. Have any people seen that? Like, if you haven't seen it, if you're interested, I highly recommend, in terms of political history and bringing historical racism into our discourse. This is really powerful. And I think we're seeing a lot of that type of discourse on the left, recognizing things like structural inequality, gender inequality, inequality against LGBTQ communities, and so forth. So I think a lot of what we're seeing, for me, also on the left, I should point out, there was a really interesting exchange between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden in one of the early Democratic debates, where Senator Harris really took Senator Biden, or Vice President Biden, to task over his support or his opposition to busing in the 1970s and 1980s, and the fact that he apparently worked civilly with segregationists early on. And so then there's this question about civility on the political landscape, and it's something that we talk about a lot here at Duke and in Sanford and at Polis, about what it means to have civil discourse. And I think for many people, they're tired of civility. They feel like civility is what's wrong with the nation. We actually have to engage in some pretty uncomfortable, perhaps knock-down, drag-out political discussions, because some things are right, some things are wrong. So I think that's a lot of the tension that we're going to see moving forward, that we're starting to see now.
And just a quick follow-up on that, it's interesting because Joe Biden is an interesting case because he practices kind of civility in his rhetoric, but there have been issues in his past where he doesn't practice civility in terms of engaging with those who, back in the early 70s, very few judged who he engaged with because those segregationists were senators. So you either ignore them or you work with them. At the same time, we're in a different stage in our country's development. Where do you see that connectivity or next? I don't know how to couch it, but essentially this civility of action versus civility of rhetoric. What's more important, do you think, for a party to espouse?
I wish I knew. I feel like that's beyond my pay grade. I might be doing something different if I had the answer. I think, it's interesting. I'm a historical institutionalist, so I feel like this is an issue that institutions must grapple with as the people that we work with continue to change and evolve. And so even in the academy, there's this question of the extent to which we engage in intellectual pursuits free from the mess of politics and engagement in the political sphere versus, some would argue that we have a moral impetus to engage in the political sphere and to add knowledge and discourse and evidence to that sphere. So I think the same thing on the left, in politics, we're seeing this question of how on earth do you engage in institutions? Especially when you have people who, might have come from a different generation, and the way that they have operated is different from the way that new people moving into those institutions want to operate. And so I think the big question is about identity of these institutions. So what do we expect our Congress to look like, and what do we expect it to do? And what do we expect our political leaders to do when they're in the institution? And so that's a big question that we ask here in the academy as well. What do we expect our colleges to do? What do we expect the faculty in the colleges to do? And what do we expect the people who learn in colleges to talk about and to do as citizens? So again, I wish I knew the answer. I think that's one of those, sort of previews, wait and see. Maybe we can find some way to create some sort of media and take advantage of whatever money can come from this. I'm sure we can monetize this somehow.
Cool, thanks, Deondra. Suzanne, you talked about it. It takes sometimes upwards of 2 decades for change to happen on a legislative level with immigration. We've seen Democrats in charge during that time. We've seen Republicans in charge, and we've seen divided government. What do you think is the secret sauce to implementing meaningful immigration reform? Is there such a thing as the right combination of political leaders on both sides?
Well, that one's above my pay grade. I think the historical perspective is really important, that there are very few moments on immigration issues where sides have come together in a functional way to address something in a timely manner. And so the fact that we are not coming together is immensely frustrating, but it's also not atypical in terms of the nature of response. And I think that's why the resort to executive orders has become more of a standard. From my perspective, because this is really implicating international refugee law, that would be a more fruitful pursuit to pursue that angle, because the international law dynamics are a little less messy, paradoxically, than the domestic politics on immigration. And, you know, sort of, I don't know if people have seen, there's a whole UNHCR campaign in the United States now. It's called Forced to Flee. And it's actually the first time UNHCR has portrayed folks coming from Latin and Central America as refugees in their social media, in their literature in general. And what they're really trying to do is get, you know, sort of American population to understand, right, these are the same as Syrians or Somalis or folks from South Sudan, that these are folks fleeing persecution. And historically in the United States, this idea that someone's fleeing persecution, we have much more sympathy and generosity in terms of public opinion than we do someone seeking a better life. It's sort of, right, it's a long-held cultural kind of way of thinking about it. But one of the things that UNHCR and folks are, if we can pivot this so people understand it as a refugee issue, we may get quicker leverage on it than we would if we talked about comprehensive migration reform in the United States. I think the other piece, just as an ethicist, that when you talk to people who have very different perspectives about what's happening and, right, like the border policy or migration policy in general, you know, sort of they're coming at it really both from two different, you know, ethical perspectives. But interestingly, they are bringing an ethical logic to bear. The ethical logics are just incommensurate, right? Their assumptions are different. The principles are different. The trade-offs they're making are different. It's not like one is ethical and one is unethical. I find one repugnant and the other not, but you can't say it's unethical in terms of its principles, right? They're trading off different ethical principles on it. But you know, sort of, you know, maybe UNHCR, which the United States is systematically trying to destroy, can covertly pivot our own immigration policy in an important way. But anyway, look out for the Forced to Flee. It's everywhere now.
And you talked about this issue at last year's What Happened event, a year ago almost today. Did you think that you would still be talking about it? Did you think we would still be kind of in the same point or worse?
I found it, right, I would not have expected we would still be talking about it. I would not have expected it to get worse. I would have thought the current administration would have grown tired of it and moved on to something else. And so, right, and that it is getting worse is disturbing.
Simon, I read something the other day about how a new administration was going to have a tough time rolling back a lot of the changes that we've had with our allies, with our foes. I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that issue. What you know, we all have personal views on this platform. We are all nonpartisan officially, but we're talking about, you know, a president and the president's position. So if another president took over in 2021, what could change, and what really is embedded now into the fabric of those relations?
Well, I think the bottom line is the transactionality, which has been always present in a sense. You know, the United States did not rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan purely out of the goodness of its own heart. That's not an irrelevant factor, but it is not the sole determining factor of why the United States contributed so much to rebuild Europe in the Marshall Plan. Big part of it was that American policymakers figured it is way cheaper to do this than to fight World War III against the Soviet Union. We don't want to fight World War III for a whole host of reasons. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be brutal, it's going to be violent, it's going to be nuclear. If we alleviate the real suffering in post-war ravaged Europe in the mid-1940s, that is going to prevent us from having to be in that position. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right, is the old adage. So it's not that these things were never totally devoid of self-interest. But I think one thing that the administration has done is demonstrated the extent to which there can be a political backing amongst voters for framing these things in that way, right? NATO used to get just sky-high approval ratings, which never fluctuated. I mean, they were so steady. Any president would have killed to have approval ratings like things like NATO or the alliance with Japan or things like that. Now, in part, it's because, in a globally interconnected world, stability is good for business, especially good for business for countries like the United States. And thus, promoting stability promoted a world in which Americans could do business abroad well. Now, that is also being questioned, and it seems that there is a constituency within this country that backs that. So that's the question that if I were a foreign policymaker, I would be asking myself is, okay, maybe someone who is a really committed international institutionalist comes into office, but the things we used to take for granted as being political third rails, like going after long-term alliances, we can no longer count on being untouchable in that sense. So that's where I would be concerned, is maybe not what comes in 2020. Maybe you get a reprieve in 2020 if you're in one of these countries. It's what then comes in 2024 and what it could go back to. I think it's pretty clear that this is not just an aberration, right? The results of the 2020 presidential election will really determine whether we can call this more of an aberration or a new pattern. But if I were a foreign policymaker, I would be very worried that this is now going to become a really convenient kind of outlet for frustration, not only amongst people in power, but also voters.
Thanks, Simon. If there are any questions from you all, happy to field one, or I can just jump back in. Yes, Sean.
For Deondra, can you explain what Kamala Harris meant when she said that identity politics is the 21st century version
Of the race card. So I haven't heard that comment from her, but I would imagine if she's saying that identity politics, Kamala Harris said this. That's surprising to me. Oh, that's interesting. No, I believe it. So, I mean, it's interesting. For me, I feel like identity politics, now it could be how people are stylizing the idea. So oftentimes people talk a lot about being politically correct, or they talk about identity politics in a way that I think denigrates it. It sort of reduces a focus on gender, race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status to being something that is just an unfair thing that people might throw down to trump any type of really deep discourse. I think people think of the race card that way also as something that can be played unfairly. I think that from my perspective, especially given Senator Harris's recent exchanges with Senator Biden, with Vice President Biden and others, I mean, she absolutely feels like race is a place that we have to grapple very seriously as a nation, and we can't just, sort of tuck it away neatly or sweep it under the rug. I think that for me, one of the things I worry about when it comes to identity politics is that we can tend to be so uncomfortable with it that we do cast it aside the way that we think about things as being just politically correct. I think that there's a lot of discomfort. I think that even here at Sanford, we do our best to talk very seriously about identity. I think oftentimes when we engage in some of these discussions, we have the usual suspects show up. Because I think it's very difficult to do. I think oftentimes we require people to come and to share parts of themselves in public spaces like this that might not be something that you actually feel like doing. Especially, if you are of one of the identities where people might raise your, quote unquote, your issue and then turn to you and look to you to be the representative of that identity and that status. So I do think, for me, the idea that it could become the race card, that it could be something of a Trump card that could just shut down debate is a real issue, but it's something that we have to fight. And I think the way that we fight it is by jumping in with both feet as often as we can, getting trained and figuring out how to talk about various identities in meaningful ways and respectful ways and civil ways that leave everybody who engages in those conversations feeling heard and respected, but like they want to participate a little more. So I think that's where I see it. But I do think that moving forward, identity politics is not going anywhere. If anything, it's going to become even increasingly salient on the political stage.
Student over here. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
For Simon, when you were talking about how now that this administration has treated alliances a little more loosely, and that it's no longer really the third rail, it used to be like question alliances, would you say that that is sort of been related to how there's been a growing hostility towards American relationship with the state of Israel on the opposite side of that?
So Israel has kind of always been the weird outlier, right, to all of this. It's been basically a bipartisan consensus that Japan's cool, South Koreans are cool, the Europeans are cool. Israel has always been the outlier in this. There's a complicated history to that. So I'm a little hesitant in lumping the two together because that has been something people have been less willing to touch. That being said, apropos of folks like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and the other members of the so-called, did they name themselves the Squad or did the
Apparently
media?
they took a selfie and had a placard, like a little label, and they just said Squad.
Okay. Well, they have definitely been much more vocal about this issue than has generally been thought to be a good idea for an elected official, just from a vote-getting perspective. I'm not talking about this morally or normatively at all, just from a purely vote-getting perspective. They have shown that you can actually go further on this issue and still not, not only not lose votes, but they're doing great email fundraising on exactly this issue, or rather on the attacks from the president provoked by this issue. So I would be hesitant to lump those in together. I think Israel has historically been an issue where there's a lot more flux. I think that will continue to be the case. What is changing is how people see a lot of America's other alliances.
That's over here.
So can you say another sentence? What's your interest in the forest? Or
What is so crucial to I know of course that's not kind of totally also the strategy of keeping potentially big families together and the centers that
right. So I guess the principle of it, right? So it was a civil suit, right, which is now being undermined by a policy, which says you can, right, basically be kept in indefinite detention. The problem with that sort of ruling is that is in fact consistent with the international law on refugee law and policy. So the U.S. is strategically playing on certain principles when it's convenient, vis-a-vis refugee law, and then drawing on others when it's coming to immigration law. And so that's one of the trade-offs that's being made in that particular. And many of those things are also, right, they're in dispute. So that's not happened quite yet, but conceivably it will soon.
We'll do 2 or 3 more questions. Gunther over here, and then you two, and then we'll wrap it up. Cool.
Is there a kind of opportunity/risk for the left to learn from the kind of populist nationalism that is in the White House today? In other words, I think one of the things that's interesting is what you're alluding to this speech, right? Like, what is the left learning? And it's not whether it's the left or right, but on immigration, for example. Is there an opportunity for the left to kind of reclaim the nation, or to actually be more strategic in the way it represents the nation rather than handing it to, especially in foreign policy? What is the left's response to a very different kind of isolationism, /nationalism? I'm not sure what it is. What it depends on which tweet you read. And then on the whole notion of Americans, this is what's so remarkable and inspiring about this history, is this ferocious contest over which America. Langston uses let America be American. I guess I'm wondering if you you see in the left that strategic wherewithal, or is it just more, is the left responding reacting?
I'm happy to weigh in if, but.
So I would just say on the immigration, and that's sort of where I started, right? I think the left is responding with oftentimes with the same bombastic approach and not thinking strategically about where they have the greatest leverage and how, right, both kind of legal leverage, but also popular opinion leverage. And this is why the kind of UN approach is actually kind of interesting, getting people to think differently about what the issue is, because it has been so framed by the right, as invaders taking your job, taking your home, taking your children away from you, right, terrorism. And if it can be pivoted, I think there's a real strategic opportunity. But the response has been, can we out-bombast without, and almost responding to things that aren't real, which then are an utter waste of time.
Can I add, just to your point, and we'll get to the last two, is it's interesting, like, what is the response from the left? As if there is a left, right? No, but, I mean, and that's not a challenge to Professor Peck. And that's part of the challenge. We have a really interesting case right now where we have a Republican president who's followed a two-term Democratic president, who's followed a two-term Republican president, who's followed a two-term Democratic president. I don't think that's an accident. I think as a country, we are embracing the known until we can't vote for the known, and then we want something different. And that's been going on. And if you look throughout political history in the United States, even three of those, or even, really three, have never happened before. So the idea is the who or the what is the left will come out of whatever, comes out of this Democratic primary. And then that person, rightly or wrongly, will speak for the left. In the same way that Donald Trump really, in marked ways, changed the Republican Party, even though some would say he just added to some of the principles that Republicans had but were too afraid to talk about or implement. But the reality is that that's one of the challenges of being a party out of power, is that there is no unified response until you're forced to have one by a single person.
On the, just briefly on the foreign policy issue, I mean, isolationism is back. If you look at Elizabeth Warren's policy, which she calls economic nationalism, which is a concept I find wholly reprehensible, and how Bernie Sanders talks about the United States as trading partners, and also about people who come to the United States to work. They sound a lot like Donald Trump. You take out, I mean, there's a lot of bombast, but if you just boil it down to policies, there's not a whole lot of daylight between Donald Trump's policies on economics, especially international economics, and Elizabeth Warren's and Bernie Sanders. They're all basically mercantilists. And ditto about American engagement in the world. Again, they might be much more palatable to the average person as far as how they present it, but what they're saying about people taking advantage of the United States, I think there's a huge amount of overlap. And the reason for this is in part because there are a lot of Americans who believe that, not without reasons, and because Donald Trump has shown that it can actually be an effective and working campaign tactic in order to get people to come vote for you.
Cool. If that's okay, then we'll jump to the last two questions. We'll start here and we'll wrap up with you. Great.
I'm wondering if you can speak to any lessons you might take from the school similar to what events like happening in school that we could think about in this context, and whether there's something there that can help alleviate disorder or change the about things, or this was like a completely different.
So I think it's right. Like, I think the historic examples are really important because this happens over and over again in the United States. I think the challenge is making clear, right, in the current debate how problematic the Japanese internment was, and repeating it is not a good idea. I think that in the current debate, history, facts, right, trends, they're all like leached from the debate, and the immigration debate in particular, right? The data, right, that is shared in a popular rhetoric is just all wrong, right? This happens over and over and over again, right? And the weird thing too is there's lots of evidence that says the average American has very little idea what is ever actually going on vis-a-vis migration, right? So if you surveyed the US population, right, they would mostly say, oh, it's increasing dramatically, right? In lots of ways, it's decreasing dramatically. And so there's this disconnect historically in the way people think, which then makes it even harder to invoke the history. I think if you could and find ways to do that, it would be really useful. Figuring that out, I think, is super challenging.
Great question. Last question over here.
Hi, so my question is probably directed at Mr. Rose, or really at you. Some of the 2020 candidates have made protecting our democracy a key part of their platform. Senator Warren talked about it, Buttigieg, and Klobuchar, among others. How would you describe the magnitude of that problem, and what would you say are important responses to this idea of the erosion of our democracy?
Can I start? Yeah, so I love that question, Dahlia. I think it's a huge issue. I think that, if we're thinking about democracy as governance by the people, and this idea that all people have the capacity to participate in the exercise of determining who has political power, the fact that we are seeing so many erosions of voting rights in the United States, especially in recent years. Even North Carolina has been grappling with its own voter ID policies that are coming out of different referenda and being challenged in the courts and beyond. I mean, my sense is that this is something that I don't know that we're taking seriously enough as a nation. I think that if we think about even with voter ID policies, who are the people who are typically most likely to be disenfranchised by those types of attempts? Typically, they're people who have less income. They tend to be older citizens. They're more likely to be minorities. And we note some trends in who tends to vote for which party. Younger citizens, minorities. So I mean, this is politics at play. And so I do think that we have a responsibility as a nation to ensure that everyone has access to the capacity to exercise their rights as citizens, to engage in democracy. I think this is also a really politically relevant issue at the same time that we're not likely to see go away.
Russia will do everything in its power to influence the outcome of the 2020 elections. They will likely do that in order to help Donald Trump get elected, or reelected rather. But really, that's not the point. The point is to undermine the basic concept of and desirability of democracy. Right? If it also puts or keeps someone in the Oval Office who is amenable to them, then that's a really nice bonus. But the basic goal is to make democracy much less palatable and interesting to people around the world. Not just to people in Russia who live in a system of what's euphemistically called managed democracy, but also to people on the borders of Russia, to people especially in Ukraine, so that they look east to Russia and not west to the European Union and NATO as what their future could look like. So that's coming. It came in the midterms. It's been coming in all of the elections of major democracies around the world. They're partners in this effort, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just working in the same direction, are the Chinese, who also wage massive scale information warfare along those same lines and with those same goals. And this is a big problem. And it's going to be a big problem in 2020, in large part because I think a lot of, Deondra talked about institutions, a lot of the institutions that used to act as gatekeepers, that used to act as safety valves, as checks, and as balances on a lot of the types of behaviors which are really driven by a lot of Russian information warfare, have either been pushed out of the way or have just folded. Right? And I think we see this across the political spectrum. I could talk to you for hours about, for example, the effective suicide of the Claremont Institute, which from the 1970s was a major center of conservative thought, which used to stand for things, and has now totally just gone all in on Trumpist-style populism. And part of that is this total refusal to acknowledge that anything is happening with Russia, right? But things will happen, and they're going to come probably they're happening now, and it's going to escalate as we get closer and closer to the 2020 elections, in part because it's what they want, and in part because a lot of the antibodies just aren't in the political system anymore.
Great. And just to leave it on a little more positive note, some of you may have heard there was a 17-year-old, Ned Ledbetter, I forgot his first name, who was at a Popeyes the other day, and there was a long line, so we started handing out absentee ballot information and registration forms here in North Carolina. The idea that for every the antibody, if I'm using that correctly in this context, is really on a grassroots level challenging a system that isn't working right. And so for every calamitous thing that we saw on the screen or heard about today, there is a counter to that, which are people who are outraged and want something different. And as long as that outrage continues and it's well placed, that's kind of what our democracy has been built on. So with that in mind, I want to thank sincerely Professor Rose, Professor Shanahan, Professor Miles, thank Leslie Parkins and Lindsay Miller from from the Office of Civic Engagement. And really just thank you all for being here on your second day of classes, and just know that we are here collectively, we being Sanford and Keenan Institute and Civic Engagement and other entities, to engage with you. If you have questions or you just want to sit down and try to make sense of this crap for 20 minutes and make sure that you're not the one who's crazy, like they're the ones who are crazy, we're happy to talk with you about it. And we all benefited from that when we were in college, so we want to make sure you all have that experience too. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you.